The summer heat pressed down on Pine Avenue like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of day where the air shimmered above the pavement and even the pigeons looked for shade. Officer James Mercer wiped sweat from his brow as he adjusted his police cap. 12 years on the force, and he still hated July patrol shifts more than anything. His radio crackled with routine calls while he walked his beat downtown. Nothing serious today, just the usual shoplifters and parking disputes. James took a long drink from his water bottle, the cold liquid a brief relief from the punishing sun. His uniform already had dark patches of sweat forming under the arms and across his back. Another peaceful day in paradise, he muttered to himself, a phrase his fellow officers would recognize as pure sarcasm. James had never planned to spend his entire career in this neighborhood. He'd always imagined moving up to detective or at least transferring to a cushier district. But here he was, still walking the same streets, seeing the same faces that over the years had shown him less and less respect. The crowd gathered in Civic Center Plaza didn't improve his mood. From 2 blocks away, he could hear chanting and see the homemade signs bobbing above heads. James sighed heavily. The demonstration had been announced days ago, another protest about police conduct, but he'd hoped to avoid it entirely. Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer. There's a gathering at the plaza. Approximately 50 people. Peaceful so far, just keeping an eye on things. Copy that, Mercer. Additional units are already aware. Just monitor unless situation changes. James approached slowly, surveying the scene. Most of the protesters were young, college-aged probably, with a mix of older community members. They held signs with familiar slogans about justice and accountability. Nothing he hadn't seen before. Nothing that would change anything. He stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, water bottle still clutched in his right hand. The protesters gave him a wide berth, continuing their chants but keeping their distance. That's how it usually went. Both sides aware of each other, neither wanting to escalate things. Then he spotted her. Tasha Wilson stood slightly apart from the main group, talking with a small circle of people who nodded at her words. James knew who she was, everyone in the department did. A community organizer who'd been a thorn in the department's side for years, always showing up at city council meetings, always quoted in the local paper whenever there was an incident. Tasha wore her hair in neat braids piled atop her head. Despite the heat, she looked perfectly composed in a crisp blue blouse and dark slacks. No protest t-shirt or jeans for her. She looked like she could have been heading to a business meeting instead of leading a demonstration. James felt his jaw tighten. 2 months ago, he'd been called into the captain's office after a traffic stop went wrong. The driver had filed a complaint, claiming James had been aggressive and disrespectful. The complaint went nowhere, they usually did, but the captain had mentioned Tasha Wilson's name. She's watching our department closely, the captain had warned. Don't give her any ammunition. Now here she was, not 20 feet away. James watched as she finished her conversation and turned toward the center of the plaza. She hadn't noticed him yet. Maybe she wouldn't. But then someone in her group pointed in his direction and Tasha's eyes met his. She said something to her companions and began walking directly toward him. James felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the weather. "Officer," she said, her voice clear and professional. "I'm glad you're here. We've notified the department about our demonstration permit. Everything's in order." James nodded stiffly. "Just keeping an eye on things." "Of course." Tasha smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Your presence is appreciated, though we've arranged for our own community. Peacekeepers as well." She gestured toward several people, wearing bright yellow vests scattered throughout the crowd. "Your peacekeepers don't have any actual authority," James said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "They're not meant to replace police," Tasha replied evenly. "They're here to help keep our own demonstration respectful and on message. We're all interested in safety." A young man approached Tasha, handing her a megaphone. "We're ready to start the speeches," he told her. Tasha nodded her thanks and turned back to James. "You're welcome to listen, officer. You might find it educational." The comment stung like a slap. James felt heat rising from his collar to his face. "I've heard it all before," he replied, voice tight. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Tasha said quietly. "Hearing isn't the same as listening." Before James could respond, she turned away, raising the megaphone as she walked to the center of the plaza. The crowd began to gather around her, their separate conversations dying down in anticipation. "Good afternoon, everyone. Tasha's voice boomed across the space. "Thank you for coming out today despite this heat. Your presence shows how important this issue is to our community." James remained where he was, feet planted firmly on the edge of the gathering. He should have walked away, continued his patrol around the perimeter. That would have been the professional thing to do. Instead, he stood rooted to the spot, listening as Tasha began to speak about recent incidents involving the police department. 3 weeks ago, a 17-year-old boy was stopped while walking home from basketball practice, Tasha said. He was handcuffed and made to sit on the curb for 45 minutes because he matched a description. No charges were filed. No apology was given. The crowd murmured its disapproval. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He hadn't been involved in that incident, but he knew the officers who were. They'd followed procedure. 2 months ago, Tasha continued, a mother was pulled over with her children in the car. The officer approached with his hand on his weapon and spoke to her in a manner that left her children in tears. Her tail light was out. That's all. James felt his pulse quicken. That had been his stop. The woman had been argumentative from the start. He'd kept his hand near his weapon as a precaution, standard procedure. And he hadn't raised his voice until she'd refused to provide her license. Tasha went on, listing incident after incident. Some James recognized, others he didn't. With each example, the crowd's reaction grew more intense, calls of agreement, sounds of outrage. "These aren't isolated incidents," Tasha said, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "These are patterns, and patterns don't change without accountability." James uncapped his water bottle and took another long drink, trying to cool the anger building inside him. This woman had no idea what it was like to wear the badge, to make split-second decisions, to face danger every day. She only saw one side of the story, never the full picture. "We're not here to condemn all police officers," Tasha continued as if she'd read his thoughts. "We know there are good officers who serve with honor and respect. We're here because the system protects those who don't. We're here because when officers cross the line, nothing happens." Several people in the crowd turned to look at James, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. He was the only uniform in sight, the physical embodiment of everything they were protesting against. "Officer Mercer," a voice called from nearby. James turned to see an older woman addressing him directly. "What do you think about what she's saying?" James felt a dozen pairs of eyes turn toward him. "I'm just here to make sure things stay peaceful," he said stiffly. "But you must have an opinion," the woman pressed. "Do you think there's a problem with accountability in your department?" Others were listening now, waiting for his response. Even Tasha had paused her speech. The megaphone lowered slightly as she watched the interaction. "I think," James said carefully, "that civilians don't understand the realities of police work." Someone in the small gathering crowd scoffed loudly. "That's always the excuse," a man called out. James felt his control slipping. 12 years of built-up frustration, 12 years of being second-guessed and criticized by people who'd never worn the uniform, bubbled, dangerously close to the surface. "It's not an excuse," he shot back. "It's a fact. You have no idea what we deal with every day." "And you have no idea what we deal with every day," a young woman countered, stepping forward. "The fear when we see those lights behind our car. The way we have to teach our children to behave around police so they don't get hurt." James shook his head, jaw clenched tight. "If people would just comply with lawful orders." "Compliance isn't protection," Tasha's voice cut in. She had approached again, though the megaphone was now at her side. "We've seen too many examples of that." The crowd had shifted, many people now focusing on this confrontation rather than the main demonstration. James felt sweat trickling down his back, his collar suddenly too tight. "You're making it worse," he said to Tasha, keeping his voice low, filling their heads with the idea that we're the enemy. "I'm pointing out problems that need fixing," Tasha replied calmly. "If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe ask yourself why." Something in her composed expression pushed James over the edge. The heat, the crowd, the accusations, it all crashed down on him at once. "You think you know everything," he said, voice rising. "You sit in your community meetings and make judgments without ever walking in our shoes. You have no idea what it's really like." Tasha didn't flinch at his tone. "Then educate us, Officer Mercer. That's why we're here, to have a dialogue." "This isn't a dialogue," James snapped, gesturing to the signs in the crowd. "This is a public shaming. You've already decided we're guilty." People had formed a loose circle around them now, Phones raised to record the exchange. In some distant part of his mind, James knew he should walk away. This was exactly the kind of situation the captain had warned him about. But he couldn't seem to stop himself. "We're asking for accountability," Tasha said, still maddeningly calm. "That's not the same as guilt." "You named me specifically in your complaint last month," James said, his voice tight. "A routine traffic stop, and you tried to make it sound like harassment." Something flickered across Tasha's face. Surprise, perhaps. "I didn't file a complaint against you, Officer Mercer. If someone did, it wasn't me." "Right," James said, disbelief evident in his tone. "It just happened to mention your organization." "Many people in the community come to us when they feel they've been treated unfairly," Tasha explained. "We help them navigate the complaint process. That's part of our work." James felt the water bottle in his hand, still half full. Without thinking, without allowing himself to think, he twisted the cap off. "You know what your problem is?" he said, stepping closer to Tasha. "You're always talking about how hot it is under the spotlight, but you've never felt the heat yourself." And then he did it, a motion that took less than a second but would change everything. James tipped the water bottle, pouring its contents directly over Tasha Wilson's head. The cold water cascaded down, soaking her braids, running in rivulets down her face and neck, darkening the shoulders of her blue blouse. For one frozen moment, no one moved or spoke. Tasha stood perfectly still, water dripping from her chin, her expression shifting from shock to something harder, something that held the weight of every story she'd just been telling the crowd. The silence shattered all at once. Voices rose in anger. Phones captured everything. Someone shouted for more officers. The yellow-vested peacekeepers moved quickly to create space between James and the increasingly outraged crowd. And all James could think, as the empty water bottle dangled from his fingers, was how very, very quiet Tasha Wilson had become, and how much that silence terrified him. Time seemed to slow down. Droplets of water hung in the air around Tasha's face before sliding down her cheeks like tears. The crowd's reaction came in waves, first shocked silence, then scattered gasps, and finally a rising chorus of outrage that swelled across the plaza. James stood frozen, the empty plastic bottle still dangling from his fingers. The enormity of what he'd just done crashed over him like a wave. 12 years on the force, and he'd never lost control like this, not even during the worst arrests, not even when suspects had spat in his face or cursed his family. Yet here, in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, he'd doused a civilian with water. A black woman, a community leader. The realization made his stomach turn. "Officer Mercer just assaulted her," someone shouted. "Did you all see that?" called another voice. "I got it on video," came a response from the back of the crowd. Phones were everywhere now, raised high to capture the moment, each one a witness that couldn't be silenced or intimidated, each one broadcasting his mistake to the world in real time. Tasha remained perfectly still, water streaming from her carefully styled braids, her blouse now clinging to her shoulders. Only her eyes moved, scanning the faces around her, taking in the reaction of the crowd. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the tense silence that had fallen between shouts. "This," she said, "is exactly what we're here to talk about." She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She didn't retaliate. Instead, she reached slowly into her pocket and pulled out a small pack of tissues. With careful, deliberate movements, she began to dab at her face. "When authority figures feel challenged," she continued, her voice steady, "this is how some of them respond. Not with words, not with understanding, but with intimidation and humiliation." The crowd pressed closer, anger radiating from them like heat from the pavement. Several of the yellow-vested peacekeepers moved to form a loose circle around Tasha and James. "Everyone stay calm," one of them called out, a tall woman with graying hair. "Give them space." James finally found his voice. He began, but the words died in his throat. What could he possibly say? Sorry seemed laughably inadequate. His radio crackled to life, cutting through his thoughts. "Mercer, this is dispatch. We're getting multiple calls about an incident in the plaza. What's your status?" James raised the radio to his lips, his hand trembling slightly. "This is Mercer. There's been a situation. I need backup at the plaza, non-emergency." "Copy that. Units are on their way. Can you clarify the nature of the situation?" James swallowed hard. Just send backup, he said, not wanting to describe his actions over the open channel. He clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at Tasha again. She had finished drying her face as best she could, though her clothes remained soaked. "Officer Mercer," she said, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "I want your badge number and the name of your supervising officer." "Wilson." He started. "Ms. Wilson," she corrected him firmly. "And I'd like that information now, please." A young man pushed forward through the crowd, phone in hand. "I got everything on video," he told Tasha. "From the moment he started arguing with you. It's already uploading to my cloud storage." "Thank you, Devon," she said, not taking her eyes off James. More people were calling out now, demanding James's badge, insisting he be arrested on the spot. The circle of peacekeepers tightened, trying to maintain order. "Everyone, please." Tasha raised her voice for the first time, addressing the crowd. "This is exactly why we organize peacefully. Please step back and let the proper procedures take their course." "Proper procedures won't do anything," someone shouted. "They never do." "That's why we document," Tasha replied firmly. "That's why we record. That's why we show up to every city council meeting and speak out. The system only works if we make it work." James felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill that had settled in his chest. His training finally kicked in, and he knew he needed to defuse this situation before it escalated further. "My badge number is 4732, he said, loud enough for those recording to hear clearly. "Lieutenant Howard is my supervisor. You can file your complaint through the proper channels." Tasha gave him a look that made him feel like a child being lectured. "Oh, I will certainly follow proper channels, Officer Mercer. But this isn't just about a complaint form. This is about what happened here today in front of all these witnesses." In the distance, James heard sirens approaching, backup arriving. He wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. A commotion at the edge of the crowd caught his attention. People were stepping aside, making way for someone pushing through. James felt his blood run cold when he saw who it was. Deputy Mayor Chen moved with purpose, her face set in a grim expression. Behind her followed a man James recognized immediately, Richard Torres, the civil rights attorney whose face had been on billboards and TV commercials for years. "Oh no," James whispered under his breath. "Deputy Mayor." Chen reached the center of the commotion and took in the scene. Tasha standing with wet clothes. James holding an empty bottle, the crowd of angry witnesses. "What's happening here?" Chen demanded, though the look on her face suggested she already had a good idea. Before anyone could answer, another voice cut through the crowd. "I can tell you exactly what happened. Madam Deputy Mayor?" The speaker was an older black man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Professor Wade Thompson from the City University. James had seen him quoted in newspaper articles about police reform. "Officer Mercer here," Thompson continued, took it upon himself to pour water over Ms. Wilson's head when she challenged his views during a peaceful exchange. Chen's eyes widened, then narrowed as she turned to James. "Is this true, officer?" James opened his mouth, closed it again. Denial would be pointless with so many witnesses and videos. "There was a misunderstanding," he managed finally. "A misunderstanding?" Torres, the attorney, repeated incredulously. "I just watched a video that's already circulating online. There was no misunderstanding. You assaulted a civilian because you didn't like what she was saying." More sirens wailed in the background, getting closer. James saw 2 patrol cars pull up at the edge of the plaza. Officers Lee and Rodriguez climbed out, scanning the scene with concerned expressions. "Officers," Chen called, waving them over. "Please secure this scene." Lee approached cautiously, clearly confused about why the deputy mayor was present at what should have been a routine demonstration. "What's the situation, ma'am?" "The situation," Torres cut in before Chen could respond, "is that your colleague here just committed assault and battery against Ms. Wilson, and it was captured on multiple devices." Rodriguez looked at James with disbelief. "Mercer, what happened?" James couldn't meet his colleague's eyes. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "A mistake?" Someone from the crowd called out. "You deliberately poured water on her head." The crowd's anger was building again. Even with the additional officers present, James could feel the situation slipping out of control. Tasha raised her hands, calling for quiet. "Everyone, please. Let the officers do their job. We've made our point peacefully today. Let's not undermine it now." Amazingly, the crowd listened to her. the shouting dying down to a murmur of discontent. Chen stepped closer to Tasha. "Ms. Wilson, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Madam Deputy Mayor," Tasha replied. "Just wet and disappointed. I'd like to speak with you privately," Chen said quietly. "And I'm sure Mr. Torres would as well." Torres nodded, already pulling out a business card. "Ms. Wilson, I'd be happy to represent you in this matter pro bono if necessary." James watched this exchange with growing dread. The deputy mayor and a high-profile civil rights attorney both witnessed what had happened and were now openly offering support to Tasha. This wasn't going to be a simple disciplinary hearing or a slap on the wrist. His career flashed before his eyes, not the successful one he'd once imagined, but the actual one he'd lived. 12 years of growing resentment. 12 years of feeling underappreciated and misunderstood. 12 years that might end today because of 6 seconds of lost control. Officer Lee approached him, speaking low. "Mercer, what were you thinking? The captain is going to lose his mind when he hears about this." "You think I don't know that?" James hissed back. "He's already on his way," Rodriguez added, checking his phone. "Someone sent him the video." He texted the whole squad. James felt the blood drain from his face. Captain Rivera was a fair man, but he was also a stickler for professionalism and public image. The department had been under scrutiny for months, and Rivera had repeatedly warned all officers to be on their best behavior. "This isn't just about you anymore," Lee continued. "This makes all of us look bad." A new commotion arose from the edge of the crowd. People were pointing at their phones, showing each other something. New information was spreading through the gathered protesters like wildfire. "What now?" James asked, dreading the answer. Rodriguez glanced at his own phone, then looked up at James with wide eyes. "Man, you really stepped in it this time. What are you talking about? That woman you doused? Tasha Wilson?" Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. "She was just appointed to head the Civilian Police Oversight Committee last week. It hasn't been publicly announced yet, but it's all over the department message boards now." James felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "The Oversight Committee? She's the new head?" "That's not all," Lee added grimly. "Her father was Captain Wilson. Retired 5 years ago, Wilson," James repeated, the name finally clicking into place. "Thomas Wilson?" Lee nodded. "The same. Your dad served with him back in the day, didn't he?" James closed his eyes briefly, memories flooding back. His father, also a cop, had often spoken of his partner Thomas with respect and admiration. They'd worked together for years before being assigned to different districts. "Does she know?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That you're Jack Mercer's son?" Lee shrugged. "No idea. But she's about to find out, along with everyone else." A heavy silence fell between the three officers. The crowd continued to mill about, many still recording, others showing each other the videos already circulating online. "You've got about 2 minutes before the captain gets here," Rodriguez said finally. "What are you going to do?" James looked across the plaza to where Tasha stood, still talking with Chen and Torres. Despite everything that had happened, she maintained her composure, occasionally dabbing at her damp clothing with the tissue. "I need to apologize," James said suddenly. Lee grabbed his arm. "Whoa, hold on. The union rep would tell you not to say anything until they get here." "This isn't about the union," James replied, pulling free. "This is about doing the right thing." "The right thing would have been not pouring water on her in the first place," Rodriguez pointed out. James couldn't argue with that. But he knew he couldn't just stand there waiting for the captain to arrive, waiting for this situation to be taken completely out of his hands. He had made this mess. At the very least, he should try to face it with some dignity. "I've got to try," he said, more to himself than to his colleagues. Lee and Rodriguez exchanged concerned glances, but didn't stop him as he began walking across the plaza toward Tasha Wilson, toward what remained of his career, and whatever consequences awaited him there. Every step James took toward Tasha felt heavier than the last. The crowd parted reluctantly before him, faces glaring with mistrust and anger. He heard muttered comments. "Can't believe he's coming back," and "Someone stop him." But no one moved to block his path. Tasha noticed his approach first. She paused mid-sentence in her conversation with Deputy Mayor Chen and Civil Rights Attorney Torres, her expression carefully neutral as she watched him draw nearer. "Officer Mercer," Chen said sharply when she realized he was approaching, "I think you've done enough damage today. James kept his eyes fixed on Tasha. "I'd like to speak with Ms. Wilson, if she's willing." "Absolutely not." Torres stepped between them, his hand raised like a barrier. "My client has nothing to say to you without proper representation." "Your client?" James repeated, his brow furrowing. "Mr. Torres has offered to represent me in this matter," Tasha explained calmly. "Given the circumstances, I've accepted." James felt his heart sink further. Of course she'd gotten a lawyer already. Of course it was Torres, who had won multiple high-profile cases against the police department over the years. "Please, just 2 minutes," James said. "I just want to—" "Officer Mercer!" The voice cut through the plaza like a thunderclap. Captain Rivera strode toward them, his face a storm cloud of barely contained fury. He was still in his dress uniform, clearly having left a meeting or official function to come directly to the scene. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to watch the captain's approach. Even those still recording with their phones lowered them slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Rivera stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene with one sweeping glance. Tasha's wet clothes, James' deflated posture, the deputy mayor and Torres flanking Tasha protectively. "Captain," James began. "I can explain." "Not another word, Mercer," Rivera snapped. "Officers Lee and Rodriguez have briefed me on what happened here." He turned to Tasha, his tone shifting to one of professional concern. "Ms. Wilson, on behalf of the department, I want to express my deepest apologies for Officer Mercer's completely unacceptable behavior." "Thank you, Captain," Tasha replied. "I appreciate that. I've already contacted Internal Affairs," Rivera continued. "They'll want your statement as soon as possible." He glanced at Torres. "I see you've already secured representation." Torres nodded. "Ms. Wilson shouldn't have to navigate this process alone." "Of course," Rivera agreed, then turned back to James. "Officer Mercer, surrender your badge and weapon to Officer Lee. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." The words hit James like physical blows. He'd expected a reprimand, maybe even temporary desk duty, but immediate suspension was far more serious. "Captain, please," James said, his voice low. "At least let me apologize first." Rivera's eyes narrowed. "You've done enough talking for today. Now do as I've ordered." A hush fell over the crowd as James slowly unclipped his badge from his uniform and removed his service weapon from its holster. Officer Lee approached cautiously to take them, avoiding eye contact as he did. The reality of what was happening, of what he had done, crashed down on James with crushing force. In one moment of anger, he had likely destroyed his career. 12 years of service reduced to this humiliating public spectacle. "Actually," Tasha said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "I would like to hear what Officer Mercer has to say." All eyes turned to her in surprise. "Ms. Wilson," Torres began cautiously. "I wouldn't advise—" "I understand your concern," she interrupted gently, "but I think it's important. If Officer Mercer wants to speak, I'm willing to listen." Rivera looked skeptical but nodded. "It's your choice, Ms. Wilson." James found himself the focus of dozens of stares, many still recording with their phones. The words he'd planned to say suddenly evaporated from his mind. He began, then faltered. He took a deep breath and tried again. "What I did was inexcusable. I let my anger get the better of me, and I acted in a way that violated everything the badge is supposed to stand for." The crowd remained silent, watching. "I'm sorry, Ms. Wilson. Not just for pouring water on you, but for not listening. For not being the kind of officer I should be." Tasha studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Why did you do it, Officer Mercer? What made you so angry that you felt the need to humiliate me that way?" It was a direct question that deserved a direct answer. James struggled to find the words. "I felt attacked. Not physically, but everything you were saying about the department, about officers not being held accountable. I took it personally." "Because you've had complaints filed against you before," Tasha stated. "It wasn't a question." James nodded reluctantly. "Yes, 3 in the past year." "And what happened with those complaints?" James shifted uncomfortably. "They were not sustained. Insufficient evidence." A murmur ran through the crowd. Tasha nodded slowly as if his answer confirmed something she already knew. "Officer Mercer," she said, "do you know who I am, beyond being a community organizer?" The question caught him off guard. I just learned that you've been appointed to head the Civilian Police Oversight Committee." "That's true," Tasha acknowledged. "But there's something else you should know." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, leaning close to whisper something in Tasha's ear. Tasha listened, then nodded. "I've just been informed," she said, addressing the gathering rather than just James, "that someone in the crowd recognized Officer Mercer as Jack Mercer's son. Is that correct, officer?" James felt a chill run down his spine. "Yes, Jack Mercer was my father." Tasha's expression softened slightly. "My father was Thomas Wilson. They were partners for 7 years. The revelation sent a shockwave through James. Of course. Wilson. He should have made the connection immediately. His father had spoken often about Thomas Wilson, always with deep respect. "Your father?" James struggled to find the words. "My dad always said Thomas Wilson was the best cop he ever knew. Said he taught him everything worth knowing about the job." "And my father spoke highly of yours as well," Tasha replied. "He said Jack Mercer had a strong sense of justice." The mention of his father's sense of justice felt like a knife twisting in James's gut. What would his father think if he could see him now? Captain Rivera, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. "Ms. Wilson, I didn't realize you were Thomas's daughter. He was an exceptional officer." "Yes, he was," Tasha agreed, "and he dedicated his life after retirement to improving police-community relations. That's what inspired my own work." She turned back to James. "When my father was on the force, officers who crossed the line were rarely held accountable. That's what drove him to advocate for change. Not because he was against police, but because he believed in what policing should be." James couldn't meet her eyes. "I understand. Do you?" Tasha asked, her voice firm but not unkind. "Because what happened today is exactly the kind of behavior that erodes trust between police and community. The kind of behavior that makes people fear those who are meant to protect them." The truth of her words struck James deeply. He had become exactly the kind of officer that good cops like his father and Thomas Wilson had tried to weed out. "The Oversight Committee isn't about punishing officers," Tasha continued. "It's about upholding standards. Standards that officers like your father and mine believed in." A commotion at the edge of the plaza drew everyone's attention. A news van had pulled up, and a reporter and cameraman were making their way toward the gathering. "Great," James muttered. "Just what we need." Torres stepped forward. "I'll handle the press," he told Tasha. "You don't need to make any statements right now." But Tasha shook her head. "Actually, I think this is an important moment. One worth documenting." She turned to address the crowd, which had grown considerably since the incident began. Some were still from the original demonstration, but others were passers-by who had stopped to watch the drama unfold. "What happened here today," she said, her voice clear and steady, "was unfortunate. But it's also an opportunity to show that accountability is possible, that we can have difficult conversations about police conduct without demonizing all officers." Captain Rivera nodded approvingly, though his expression remained grim when he glanced at James. The reporter had reached them now, microphone in hand, cameramen following close behind. "Ms. Wilson," the reporter began, "we've received multiple videos of an incident between you and a police officer. Can you tell us what happened?" Tasha glanced at James before answering. "There was an altercation during our peaceful demonstration. The officer involved has been suspended and the department is taking appropriate action." "Will you be pressing charges?" the reporter pressed. All eyes turned to Tasha. James held his breath, knowing that assault charges would mean the end of his career, possibly even jail time. "I haven't made that decision yet," Tasha replied carefully. "I'll be consulting with my attorney to determine the most appropriate course of action." The reporter turned to Captain Rivera. "Captain, does this incident reflect a pattern of behavior in your department?" Rivera straightened his shoulders. "The actions of Officer Mercer today do not reflect the values or training of our department. We hold our officers to high standards, and there are consequences when those standards aren't met." As the interview continued, James stood silent, feeling increasingly irrelevant to the conversation happening around him. His future was being discussed as if he wasn't even there. Officer Rodriguez approached quietly. "The captain wants you to leave the scene," he said in a low voice. "Go directly to the station and wait in his office. Don't talk to anyone else, especially not the press." James nodded numbly. As he turned to go, he caught Tasha's eye one last time. "Ms. Wilson," he said quietly, "I truly am sorry." Tasha held his gaze for a long moment. "I believe you are, Officer Mercer. But being sorry isn't enough. Not anymore." With those words hanging in the air, James turned and walked away from the crowd, away from the cameras, away from the career he had just destroyed. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge that his worst moment would now be preserved online forever. A perfect example of everything wrong with policing. He had nearly reached the edge of the plaza when he heard someone calling his name. He turned to see Devon, the young man who had first recorded the incident, jogging to catch up with him. "Officer," Devon said, slightly out of breath, "there's something you should know." "What's that?" James asked warily. "Ms. Wilson," Devon said, looking over his shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. "She's not just the head of the oversight committee. She's also the daughter of your father's old partner." "I know," James replied. "We just established that." "No, you don't understand," Devon insisted. "Your fathers weren't just partners. Your dad saved your father's life during a shootout in '98. Took a bullet that was meant for him." James stared at Devon in shock. "How do you know this?" "I'm studying criminal justice," Devon explained. "Captain Wilson comes to speak to our class every semester. He always tells that story about the partner who took a bullet for him who died a hero. He shows us the medal your father received posthumously." The world seemed to tilt beneath James's feet. "That's why I became a cop," he said quietly, more to himself than to Devon. "To follow in his footsteps, to live up to his example." Devon gave him a long look. "If that's true," he said finally, "then you've got a long way to go." With that, the young man turned and walked back toward the crowd, leaving James alone with the crushing weight of his failure, not just as a police officer, but as his father's son. James sat alone in Captain Rivera's office, staring at the wall of commendations and photographs. Among them was a faded picture of the captain's academy graduation class, 30 fresh-faced recruits ready to serve and protect. James recognized his father and Thomas Wilson standing side by side in the back row, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning widely. Heroes, both of them. And what was he? The door opened and James straightened in his chair as Captain Rivera entered, followed by Lieutenant Howard, James's direct supervisor. Either man looked at him as they took their seats. "The press is having a field day," Rivera said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Every major news outlet in the city has the video. It's trending on social media. The mayor's office has already called twice." James swallowed hard. "Captain, I'm not interested in your explanations right now," Rivera cut him off. "What you did out there wasn't just unprofessional. It was cruel and vindictive. And it was caught on camera from a dozen different angles." Lieutenant Howard shook his head. "What were you thinking, Mercer? You've had issues before, but this is completely beyond the pale." James had no answer. What could he say? That he'd momentarily lost control? That he'd been provoked? Any excuse would sound hollow even to his own ears. "Internal Affairs will handle the official investigation," Rivera continued. "But I wanted to speak with you personally before things proceed any further." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "Your father was one of the finest officers this department has ever had. He gave his life in the line of duty. And now his son has become the poster child for everything wrong with policing in this country." The words stung worse than any physical blow. James looked down at his hands. "I've spoken with Miss Wilson," Rivera said. "She hasn't decided yet whether to press criminal charges. Given the circumstances, she would be well within her rights to do so." "What happens now?" James asked quietly. "You're suspended without pay, effective immediately," Rivera replied. "The union rep is on his way, but don't expect much support there. The union doesn't need this kind of publicity any more than the department does." Lieutenant Howard slid a piece of paper across the desk. "We need your badge and gun, which you've already surrendered. This form acknowledges your suspension pending investigation." James stared at the paper but made no move to take it. "And after the investigation?" Rivera and Howard exchanged glances. "Best case scenario?" Rivera said. "Termination. Worst case? Criminal charges, loss of pension, possible jail time." The reality of his situation crashed down on James with crushing force. Everything he'd worked for, gone. His career, over. His future, uncertain at best. "There might be one option," Lieutenant Howard said cautiously. "If Ms. Wilson were willing to accept a formal apology and not press charges." Rivera shook his head. "That's not likely given the circumstances. And I'm not sure he deserves that kind of mercy." "No," James agreed quietly. "I don't." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Lee poked his head in, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to interrupt, Captain, but Ms. Wilson is here. She's asking to speak with Officer Mercer." James's head snapped up in surprise. Rivera looked equally taken aback. "She's here? Now?" the captain asked. Lee nodded. "Yes, sir." Said it couldn't wait. Rivera considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Send her in." James stood as Tasha entered the room. She had changed her clothes, now wearing a simple gray blazer over a white blouse, but her hair was still damp, her braids slightly disheveled from the earlier soaking. "Ms. Wilson," Rivera greeted her, rising from his chair. "This is unexpected." "I apologize for the interruption, Captain," Tasha replied. "But after speaking with Mr. Torres and reviewing the situation, I felt it was important to address this matter directly." "Of course," Rivera gestured to his chair. "Please have a seat," Tasha shook her head. "I won't be long. I'd just like to speak with Officer Mercer privately, if that's possible." Rivera frowned. "I'm not sure that's appropriate given the circumstances." "I understand your concern," Tasha said, "but I think it's necessary." After a moment's hesitation, Rivera nodded. "Lieutenant Howard and I will step out. Officer Lee will remain just outside the door if you need anything." "Thank you, Captain." Rivera and Howard filed out of the office, casting curious glances back as they went. When the door closed, James and Tasha were left facing each other in silence. "Why are you here?" James asked finally. Tasha took a deep breath. "After you left the plaza, I had a long conversation with Devin. He told me about our fathers, about what really happened that day." James nodded slowly. "I didn't know the full story until Devin told me. My mother, she never talked much about how my father died, just that he was killed in the line of duty. My father never got over it," Tasha said quietly. "He visits your father's grave every year on the anniversary. Brings flowers. Talks to him like he's still there." James felt a lump forming in his throat. "I didn't know. When I started my work with the community organization, he was worried at first. Thought I was positioning myself against everything he stood for, but that wasn't it at all." Tasha moved to the window, looking out at the city. "I wanted to make sure that good officers like my father, like your father, were the rule, not the exception. That's why I accepted the position on the oversight committee. And now here I am," James said bitterly, "proving why that committee is necessary." Tasha turned to face him. "Why did you become a police officer, James?" The use of his first name caught him off guard. "To honor my father, to continue his legacy." He gave a hollow laugh. "So much for that. What happened?" Tasha asked. "How did you go from wanting to honor his legacy to pouring water on a woman at a peaceful demonstration?" It was a direct question that deserved a direct answer. James searched for the right words. "I got lost, I guess. Started seeing threats everywhere. Started thinking of the community as the enemy instead of the people we're supposed to serve." He shook his head. "It didn't happen all at once. Just little by little, day by day." Tasha nodded as if his answer confirmed something she already knew. "The Oversight Committee meets tomorrow morning," she said. "Your case will be the first item on the agenda." James felt his stomach drop. "I understand." "Before that happens," Tasha continued, "I need to know something. If you could go back, not just to this morning, but to the beginning of your career, what would you do differently?" It was a question James had asked himself 1,000 times in the hours since the incident. What would he do differently? Everything. Nothing. He wasn't sure anymore. "I'd remember why I put on the badge in the first place," he said finally. "I'd remember that my father didn't just enforce the law, he served the community. He saw the humanity in everyone he encountered, even the people he arrested." He looked directly at Tasha. "And I'd remember that respect has to be earned, not demanded." Tasha studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. "The demonstration today," she said finally, "was about accountability, about officers facing consequences for their actions." She moved closer, her voice firm but not unkind. "If you truly want to honor your father's legacy, you need to accept those consequences, whatever they may be." James nodded slowly. "I know. The committee will make its recommendation to the chief tomorrow. Mr. Torres has advised me to press charges. The deputy mayor believes it would send a strong message about the city's commitment to police reform." Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of James's career, but he couldn't argue with any of it. He deserved whatever was coming. Before I make my final decision, Tasha continued, I want you to do something. Something public. What is that? James asked warily. The demonstration is still going on at the plaza. There are more people now than before. News of what happened has drawn a crowd. I'm going back there to speak. She paused, holding his gaze. I want you to come with me. James stared at her in disbelief. You want me to go back there now? Those people hate me. Yes, they do, Tasha agreed. And with good reason. But if you're serious about accountability, about making amends, then facing those people is the first step. James felt a flicker of panic at the thought of returning to the plaza, of facing the angry crowd, the cameras, the judgment. It would be humiliating, devastating, and completely deserved. What would I need to do? He asked. Just tell the truth, Tasha replied. About what you did. About why you did it. About what you've learned. It was the simplest request and the most difficult one imaginable. Will it make a difference? James asked. In terms of charges, I mean. Tasha shook her head. I'm not offering you a deal, Officer Mercer. I'm offering you a chance to begin making things right. Whether that affects my decision about pressing charges remains to be seen. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small opening, a tiny chance at redemption, or at least at facing his mistakes with some measure of dignity. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it, Tasha nodded. Good, we leave in 5 minutes. As she turned to go, James called after her. Ms. Wilson. She paused at the door. Why are you doing this? After what I did to you, why offer me any chance at all? Tasha was quiet for a moment before answering. Because my father taught me that justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. And because your father saved his life. She met his eyes steadily. But mostly because change has to start somewhere. With someone willing to admit they were wrong and do better. Maybe, just maybe, you could be that someone. With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. James stood alone in the captain's office, his future balanced on the knife's edge of the next few minutes. He had no illusions about what awaited him at the plaza. Anger, resentment, public humiliation. The thought made his knees weak. But for the first time in years, he felt something else beneath the fear and regret. Something that felt almost like purpose. If he couldn't save his career, and he probably couldn't, perhaps he could at least begin to repair some of the damage he'd done. Perhaps he could, in some small way, finally begin to honor his father's legacy. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and opened the door. I'm ready, he told Officer Lee, who stood waiting in the hallway. Take me back to the plaza. The plaza looked different now. What had been a modest gathering of protesters just hours earlier had swelled into a sea of people. News vans lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes raised high above the crowd. Police barricades had been set up to maintain order, with uniformed officers stationed at regular intervals. James sat in the passenger seat of Officer Lee's patrol car, watching the scene through the windshield with growing dread. You sure you want to do this? Lee asked, his hand still on the ignition. It's not too late to back out. James took a deep breath. Yes, it is. In the car behind them, Tasha sat with Captain Rivera, who had insisted on accompanying them after learning of Tasha's plan. The captain had been skeptical but ultimately supportive, seeing a potential opportunity to begin repairing the damage done to community relations. Let's get this over with, James said, opening the car door. As soon as they stepped out of the vehicle, heads began to turn. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. That's him. The water cop. Can't believe he came back. James kept his eyes forward, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. He wasn't in uniform anymore. Rivera had insisted he change into civilian clothes, but people recognized him anyway. The incident had been playing on a continuous loop on local news and social media for hours. Tasha and Rivera joined them, creating a small procession that made its way toward the makeshift stage that had been set up near the fountain. A podium with microphones stood ready, surrounded by reporters and cameras. You ready? Tasha asked quietly as they approached. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mouth had gone dry, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure everyone could see it. As they reached the edge of the stage, a chorus of boos and angry shouts rose from the crowd. People pressed forward, held back only by the police barricades and officers standing guard. Go home, Mercer, someone shouted. Racist cop, called another. James flinched at each cry but kept moving forward. This was part of it, facing the anger he'd earned, the consequences of his actions. Devon appeared suddenly, pushing through the crowd to reach them. "Ms. Wilson," he said urgently, "there are some folks here who aren't happy about this. They're saying you're selling out by giving him a platform." Tasha nodded. "I expected that. But this isn't about giving him a platform. It's about accountability." She stepped up to the microphone first, raising her hands for quiet. The crowd gradually settled down, their curiosity temporarily overcoming their anger. "Thank you all for staying," Tasha began. "What happened here earlier today was unacceptable. It was a violation of trust, a betrayal of the principles that law enforcement officers are sworn to uphold." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. "Many of you have asked what consequences Officer Mercer will face. That process is already underway. He has been suspended without pay, and a full investigation will determine whether his employment is terminated permanently." More sounds of approval from the crowd. "But true accountability isn't just about punishment," Tasha continued. "It's about acknowledgement, about facing those you've wronged and taking responsibility for your actions." She turned slightly. "Officer Mercer has asked for the opportunity to address you directly." The crowd erupted again, many shouting their disapproval. Captain Rivera stepped forward, raising his hands for quiet. "Please," he called out, "I understand your anger, but I ask that you listen, just as you've asked us to listen to your concerns about policing in this community." It took several minutes for the noise to die down enough for James to approach the microphone. His legs felt like lead as he stepped forward, the weight of hundreds of hostile stares pressing down on him. He looked out at the sea of faces, angry, hurt, suspicious, curious. Phones were raised everywhere, recording his every move, his every word. Whatever he said now would live forever online, just like the video of him pouring water on Tasha's head. "My name is James Mercer," he began, his voice shakier than he'd hoped. "Earlier today, I did something inexcusable. I allowed my anger and frustration to override my training, my oath, and my basic humanity." The crowd was quieter now, watching him closely. "I've spent 12 years as a police officer," James continued. "I became a cop to honor my father, who died in the line of duty saving his partner's life. That partner was Thomas Wilson, Ms. Wilson's father." Murmurs spread through the crowd at this revelation. James saw surprise on many faces. "My father believed in protecting and serving the community. He believed in treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from." James paused, swallowing hard. "Today, I betrayed everything he stood for." He turned slightly toward Tasha, who stood watching him with an unreadable expression. "What I did to Ms. Wilson was wrong. Not just unprofessional or against policy, it was wrong on a basic human level. I used my position of authority to try to humiliate someone who was exercising their constitutional right to peaceful assembly." The crowd had fallen eerily silent now, hanging on his every word. "There's no excuse for my behavior," James continued. "Not stress, not the heat, not the difficulty of the job. Nothing justifies what I did." He gripped the edges of the podium, steadying himself. "I know many of you want to see me fired. You want to see me face criminal charges. You want justice." He nodded slowly. "And you deserve that. Ms. Wilson deserves that." James took a deep breath, gathering his courage for what came next. He stepped away from the podium and turned to face Tasha directly. "Ms. Wilson," he said, loud enough for the microphones to pick up, "I am truly sorry for what I did to you today. Sorry for the disrespect, for the humiliation, for the pain I caused." And then, to the shock of everyone present, James lowered himself to his knees in front of Tasha. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Cameras flashed frantically, capturing the moment from every angle. "Please," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I am begging for the chance to make this right, not just with you, but with this community. To learn and do better." The plaza had gone completely silent. Even the reporters seemed momentarily stunned, their questions dying on their lips. All eyes were on Tasha now, waiting for her response to this unexpected display. For what felt like an eternity, Tasha simply looked down at James, her expression thoughtful but revealing nothing of her internal reaction. Finally, she stepped forward, bringing her face closer to his. "Get up, Officer Mercer," she said quietly. James remained frozen, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "I said get up," Tasha repeated more firmly this time. "This isn't what I asked you to do." Confusion washed over James's face as he slowly rose to his feet. Tasha turned to address the crowd, her voice steady and clear. What you're witnessing is not reconciliation. It's not forgiveness. It's theater. She looked pointedly at the cameras, the phones, the reporters scribbling notes. Real accountability doesn't happen in public spectacles. It doesn't happen in viral moments designed to generate sympathy. She turned back to James. It happens through consistent action, through policy change, through day-by-day commitment to doing better. James stood motionless, his face flushed with shame. I don't want Officer Mercer on his knees, Tasha continued, addressing the crowd again. I want a police department that holds its officers to the highest standards. I want systems that don't protect those who abuse their power. I want justice that doesn't depend on whether cameras are rolling. She gestured toward the gathered protesters. That's what all of us want. That's why we're here today. Captain Rivera stepped forward, nodding in agreement. Ms. Wilson is right. And as representatives of the police department, we need to listen, really listen. He turned to face James. Officer Mercer's actions today were his own, but they reflect broader issues that we must address. His suspension is just the beginning of that process. Tasha moved back to the podium. The Oversight Committee meets tomorrow morning. We will review this incident thoroughly, along with Officer Mercer's record and history with the department. We will make recommendations based on facts, not emotions or public pressure. She looked directly at James. True redemption isn't earned with grand gestures. It's earned through humble, consistent work to repair the damage done. If you're serious about making amends, Officer Mercer, that work begins after the cameras stop rolling. James nodded, understanding washing over him. His attempt at a dramatic apology had missed the point entirely. Tasha wasn't interested in public contrition, she wanted real change. I understand, he said quietly. Tasha addressed the crowd one final time. Thank you all for being here today, for bearing witness, for demanding better. The work continues tomorrow and the day after that, and every day until we build a system of justice that truly serves everyone equally. With that, she stepped away from the podium. Captain Rivera moved to escort her back through the crowd, which had begun to disperse. The immediate drama concluded. James stood alone on the stage for a moment, cameras still trained on him, reporters shouting questions he couldn't quite make out. He felt hollowed out, emptied of the anger and defensiveness that had driven him for so long. Devon appeared at the edge of the stage, watching him with an unreadable expression. What happens now? James asked as he approached the young man. Now? Devon repeated. Now you do the work. If you meant what you said, if you really want to honor your father's legacy, you figure out how to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. James nodded slowly. Even if I lose my badge? Especially then, Devon replied. This isn't about the uniform, man. It's about who you choose to be, badge or no badge. As they walked together toward the edge of the plaza, James caught sight of an elderly man standing apart from the dispersing crowd. He was watching James intently, his expression a mixture of sadness and something else, something that might have been hope. With a jolt, James recognized him from old photographs. Thomas Wilson, his father's partner, the man his father had died saving. Their eyes met across the distance, and the older man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to walk away. In that brief moment of connection, James felt something shift inside him. The journey ahead would be long and difficult. His career might be over. His reputation was in tatters. The trust he had broken could take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt the weight of his father's legacy not as a burden, but as a guide. Not as something he had failed to live up to, but as something he could still strive toward. 6 minutes had changed everything. 6 minutes that began with an act of cruelty and ended with the first faltering step toward redemption. As he walked away from the plaza, leaving behind the cameras and the crowd, James Mercer made a silent promise, not to Tasha Wilson, not to the community, not even to the memory of his father, to himself, to do the work. To be better. To begin again however he could, wherever he was allowed to. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. And it would never era